There we go. Jews in parentheses, the Ukraine. And this is actually a famous picture or painting that suggests the activities of the Jews in Eastern Europe, Poland and Ukraine. You have this Jewish innkeeper, and we'll talk about that, how Jews had a monopoly on a lot of the inns in Ukraine. A Jewish musician, which that was very popular all over Eastern Europe. Well, we know that's in the klezmer tradition now. And then that looks like a Polish nobleman who's sitting there, although he's generally, I would think he'd be drunk, but he's sitting there with his wife and child. And that's sort of an image of Eastern Europe. I wanted to start with a couple of things. Where is Ukraine? I have a feeling, Americans are so weak on geography that here's what Ukraine in the Soviet Union looked like. So it's this big section down here, including Crimea after 1956. And all this stuff in darker red is part of the Soviet Union. Okay, and they're marking the countries that are now independent that we all hear about on the news all the time. I just wanted to remind you where they are. So here's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Belarus, White Russia. And here's Ukraine. And what's not on here, and we'll see in a minute, is Galicia, where lots of the Jews come. And that's down here, Hungary, Slovakia, and Western Ukraine. It's all in here. Anybody, just to review, why did we used to call them the Ukraine and all of a sudden Ukraine? Anybody have a comment on that? Unmute yourself, and you got a comment on that?
Larry?
Yes.
I wanted to give an answer to a previous question. Where is Ukraine? And it's exactly where the Ukraine used to be, to make it clearer for people.
Jesus. Why was it the Ukraine and now just plain old Ukraine?
You can interpret my remark for that. Yes, please.
I think because when you say the Ukraine, the suggestion is it's a portion of a country, a neighborhood. Now, just Ukraine, we don't say the France or the Poland. If you say the Low Countries, but that's an exception. So that's the point, that it's the Ukrainians want to emphasize that it's an independent country. And here's how the Soviet Union broke up. You see a lot of the same names, but now you've got independent countries here. And the ones that concern us, we're looking, Ukraine, by the way, is about the size of Texas. So it's a big territory. And it borders on a lot of countries, as you see, Russia, Belarus, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova. And right across the Black Sea, you have Turkey and Bulgaria. So there's where we are. Now, I just wanted to throw in the terms Galicianer and Litvaks. We've all heard the terms. What is, and they refer to Eastern European Jews. Here's the Galicianer, and these are the negative stereotypes. I copied this from somebody. A troublemaker, a shrewd operator, a money grubber, a religious fanatic, a spineless compromiser, a speaker of popular vulgar Yiddish, and someone ashamed of his or her origins who liked to pose as an Austrian, meaning he was Austria-Hungary. But remember, this is Galicia. That's all Ukrainian peasants down there. And that's in the south. In the north, we have the Litvak. Oh, I meant to give you this picture. The image of the Galicianer, it's Purim. It says, Adlo Yada, you drink at Purim until you can't tell the difference between cups of wine. It's big for drinking, and that's the image of the Galicianer. The Litvak Cold, calculating, lacking in emotional depth, overly rational, skeptical, prone to heretical thinking, all in contradistinction to the Galicianer, who are, they're more and more emotive, naive, and the pious co-religionists. It is the Hasidim are much stronger in the south, down in Galicia. And the Litvak is seen to be withdrawn, intellectually, mercilessly critical, cold, calculating, lacking in emotional depth. He challenges authority and is by nature stubborn, suspicious of others. So this is the stereotype. And here's Lithuanian yeshiva students, 1914. You notice they don't have the long beards that you associate with the ultra-Orthodox today. It's, quote, modern, they shave. So where are the Ukrainians? Well, the Ukrainian Yiddish is somewhat different from Galician Yiddish, but not that different. So I'm including the Ukrainians in this Galicianer social group. Some Ukrainians may object to that, but and there are millions of Jews in Ukraine eventually. I mean, it's a big area. But anyway, I thought that you would be amused by these stereotypes. I certainly was, to be reminded of them. In contemporary Israel, Litai, meaning a Litvak, you automatically understand that that's an ultra-Orthodox. In Bnei Brak, if you've ever heard the term, that's the religious small city.
Where are the Lithuanians?
In Lithuania, I know. I'm going to go back to the map. Here's Lithuania itself, but Lithuanian Jews are all this area: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, parts of Poland.
So
those are the Litvaks.
okay.
And Hasidim, there are Hasidim in the north, but they're much more numerous down here. Okay, so we just saw those slides. Just Ukraine itself, and we'll see why 1654 is when we see people talk about the emergence of Ukraine as a country. And it's added, as you see here, between 1654 and 1917, as territories are wrenched away from Poland. In 1922, after the First World War, the Russians added this. After the Second World War, the Poles were chased out of this area, and Romania and Ukraine then becomes like that. And then Crimea, which is in the news all the time now, was added in 1954. And even today, most of the people living in Crimea are Russian speaking. Whether they want to be in Ukraine or not, it's a different story. But as I say, that was part of Russia until 1954 within the Soviet Union. Well, in Eastern Europe, how did Jews make a living? So this goes way back, and you'll see why it has an impact. Jews get the job as tax collectors for the Polish nobles. Now remember, Polish nobles control Ukraine. So there's no such thing as Ukraine, and the Polish, what's called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, is enormous. It includes a good deal of Ukraine. And the Jews came in and were hired by the Polish nobles to be taxes on everything, on the flour mills, on the roads, in the taverns, everything except land. And the Jews then begin to organize themselves in these regional councils. In theory, rabbis are important, but they are the strong men are the local wealthier Jews. And what happens is this what's called an orenda system is that the Polish nobles don't say, I want X amount of tax from the mills, from the flour. They just give them an amount. So here's an example. The Poles want 10,000 zloty. It's your job to go collect it. So, and they collect it from non-Jews. I mean, it's a tremendous amount of resentment against the Jews because of their role as the agents of the Polish nobility. The locals realize that the landowners are Poles, but the Poles aren't anywhere around. They're using Jews as their agents. And you get among the Jews, there's something called the Council of Four Lands, where it's not exactly a Supreme Court, but it has a lot of power to enforce various, not enforce decisions, but to resolve disputes. That's really what it was. And I remember,
Larry,
yes.
how did the Jews end up as tax collectors? Why was that the job that they ended up being able to handle?
Well, for one thing, they had more literacy than the locals, and they weren't connected to the locals. So as the Polish nobles swept in, you had begun to get Jews in Poland, and they worked out this arrangement where the Jews aren't connected to the local agricultural people. They're not interested, who are mainly Cossacks, and they just see them as a very useful kind of group. And I think the tradition of literacy is what gets them started. Literacy and numeracy. And the Jews did very well doing that for a while. But as you might imagine, there's a lot of resentment by the local population when you have that. And we'll see that in a minute.
Were they not subject to the tax themselves?
Yeah, they had internal taxes, and they had to pay X amount.
A lump sum.
But you know that's an internal affair. This is, I just show you this picture to show the image of, on the left side, the Jews who are sort of the merchants, sort of hanging around, and on the right side, it's the Ukrainian peasants dancing and presumably going in to drink in the tavern, which is ordinarily owned by Jews. It's just a graphic image. So just talking about the Jews as what are called tax farmers. And included in the taxes is the permission to run taverns. And this is in an area where there are Cossacks. That's the whole notion of what is a Cossack. I can't get into that, but let's say the Ukrainians are essentially Cossacks at the time. They are self-governing agricultural communities. In 1648, there's this uprising led by a man named Bohdan Khmelnytsky, who is headman of what's called the Zaporozhian host. Now, these are terms that appear in the newspapers now. You read about Zaporozhia has nuclear facilities that the Russians threaten to blow up. But that's, down in Ukraine, and Khmelnytsky leads this uprising. Here's an image of the heroic Khmelnytsky entering Kiev. And he is remembered before Hitler. He is seen as the most vicious oppressor of Jews in all of history. He's a Ukrainian national hero. And to the Jews, he's a mass murderer. There is a book called The Depths of Despair. Here's a copy of one line that says, now where, and Nathan Hanover is the author, in 1653, now I begin to write of the evil decrees of Khmel, may his name be obliterated, in Russia, Lithuania, and Poland in the year 1648. Of course, he doesn't write 1648, he uses the Hebrew calendar. But, and if any of you I don't think any of you have studied this alternative Hebrew alphabet, but that's the way this stuff was published. Now, the impact, we're not sure, but, population numbers are tricky in early modern times. But one estimate says there are about 40,000 Jews pre-1648 and 21,000 afterwards. And 21,000 includes 8,000 who fled to other areas. So we're talking about half the population being killed. Tom, did you have a question?
No.
No, okay. And then there is this, well, before I get to that, this is what's called the Treaty of Pereyaslav, where the Cossacks pledge allegiance to the Russian Tsar. And for the first time, the border of Ukraine is set along the Dnieper, the Dnieper River. So the left bank, it goes to Russia, left in the sense of looking south. On the left is the left bank. And you can imagine on the other side is the right bank, which is not part of Russia yet. In 1654, this is this treaty agreement made with the Russians. But after 1654, the Cossacks flourished down there. Cossacks are not subject to Russian serfdom. In fact, most of the Cossacks are serfs who escaped from up north, and they developed these independent communities. They had a kind of semi-independence, which that was crushed by Peter the Great, but they never instituted serfdom. And, you probably have seen in Yiddish literature and elsewhere how Cossacks really are seen as the enforcers of the Tsar. They have a military tradition, and they are the ones who become eventually mid to the late 19th century, the guard of the Tsar. So the Russians even see Khmelnytsky as a national hero for bringing Ukraine into, quote, eternal union of all the Russians. There's even a town now named Khmelnytsky. And it's a little weird. There's a medal named Khmelnytsky, and there was a Jewish general who had this Khmelnytsky medal. I mean, it's weird. It's like having a memorial to Hitler and having a Jewish general wear that memorial. But here he is in Kiev today. Khmelnytsky is a national hero. So there's a problem in figuring out who national heroes are, because for the Ukrainians, he's a national hero. For the Jews, he's the devil. And yet he played both those roles. Now, by 1765, again, population estimate, we have 300,000 Jews in Ukraine. And this must be a larger area than the area that had the 48,000. But this is the number that I've run across. And it's mainly on the right bank of the Dnieper River. These areas, some of you may have ancestors. Volhynia, Podolia, and the Kiev area, not in the city. And it's down there that we get the origins of Hasidism. The world is new to us every morning, and every man should believe he is reborn each day. So the Baal Shem Tov is born in the, I think, 1740s. So Hasidism emerges in this same area that we're talking about. And even though we talk about Hasidism in Galicia, some of the Ukrainian centers are Belz, Wrocław, Chernobyl. That's, when we had the atomic blow up in Chernobyl, all of a sudden, that's a Hasidic center, or had been. Just to give you some idea, here's Kiev in the center of Ukraine, and we have Chernobyl up here, right on the white Russian border, right there. And Uman, we'll say something about Uman in a minute. That's a very important Hasidic center down south. And one said that the Ukrainian type of Hasidism is characterized by a real arrogant sort of princely comportment by the Rebbes. Remember that what is characteristic of Hasidism is the role of the Rebbe as having a group. And in many cases, there were dynasties. As I've read, there are about 130 dynasties, plus individual guys all over Western Ukraine, Galicia, and a little bit further north. Hasidism does not spread as far in Lithuania as it does in the south. As I say, in the 19th century, the Hasidic centers are in Galicia. Austria-Hungary gives a little more freedom to the Jews. And I mentioned Chernobyl, and Uman is where the Bratslaver are. Now, the Bratslaver, just for curiosity, it still exists, called the Dead Hasidim, because Reb Nachman of Bratslav died, and no one replaced him. It's, I think, the only Hasidic group that continues to pay allegiance to a dead Rebbe. He's a great literary figure. I mean, he's a great storyteller. I often read these things now. In Uman today, in the middle of the war, you have Jews from Israel sneaking into Ukraine because they want to celebrate the Rebbe's birthday. Here he is right now, during the war. There they are. I don't know if that picture is taken this year, but I know that the infiltration certainly took place this year as well as other years. All right. Next, we have some geographic changes, which are just crucial for the Jews. You probably are familiar with the fact that Poland was partitioned among Prussia, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. That had a big impact on Jewish life. So this dark purple, light purple, and pinkish, whatever this is all Russian over the three partitions. This green went to Austria-Hungary, and this West Galicia went to Austria-Hungary, and this stuff here went to Prussia. So, there you have the legend at the bottom. So Poland disappears. Poland, which had been the largest country in Europe, disappears. It had no effective central government. And we have Catherine the Great, 1762 to 1796, who is the Tsarina at the time of the partitions of Poland. And Russia, they start off taking the right bank Ukraine. Remember, we said they had the left bank from 1654. Now they grab the rest of it. And she's a very autocratic figure, although, the Russians like her, but they're not too good for the Jews. Because one of the things that she does, she does try to expand serfdom in Ukraine and to exert firmer control over the Cossacks. As Ukraine is a very fertile area. It's considered the breadbasket of Europe. So it makes good sense for a kingdom to try to control that area. She establishes, this is what we are familiar with, the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement is essentially the area that the Russians have taken from during these partitions. Here's Poland. Poland means Poland-Lithuania. Lithuania as an entity doesn't exist, but it's a combined Poland-Lithuania, and here is White Russia. So all of this is grabbed by the Russians in these 30 years. And then afterwards, they institute the Pale of Settlement that say, Catherine and her government is very anti-Jewish. And all of a sudden, they've got the largest Jewish population in the world. And here is what it looks like from the north. Here's Estonia, here's Latvia, here's Lithuania, some of the places you're probably familiar with, Vilna. This is White Russia here, Vitebsk, where that's the home of Chagall, for example. Minsk is the capital of White Russia. And you get all of these Polish cities, which don't go quietly. There are several revolts in Poland in the 19th century, but it's still controlled by the Russians. And here is Ukraine, and what I would call Eastern Galicia, because Galicia is here in Austria-Hungary, but all these towns, Zhytomyr, Berdichev, Kamianets-Podolsk, these are all Jewish center, Jews near them, and they are Ukrainian Jews with their own slightly different Yiddish, but they are Galician. Just for your information, here's Odessa, which is now in the news, and Kherson, which is the city which has just been retaken by the Ukrainians. So you see, there were Jewish populations in all these areas. By 1880, we think that about 75% of all Jews in the world lived in Eastern Europe. Now, that's not only Ukraine. I mean, that's for Russia, that's Austria-Hungary, but together, that's the Yiddish-speaking world. And there are, by the way, I'm not sure if we call them dialects of Russian, but there are modes of pronunciation that mark you out, so that the Litvaks have their own pronunciation, the Galicianer have theirs, and Ukrainians are slightly different. I don't know enough about the Ukrainian Yiddish, but it's slightly different, but it's very close to the Galicianer pronunciation. For those who remember Fran Kleiner, she would always sing in a kind of a Galicianer Yiddish. It sort of fits in with the stereotype of the happy-go-lucky Galicianer instead of the scholarly Northerners. They made their living in trade, crafts, money lending, and leaseholding a bit. It declined after the Khmelnytsky stuff. They originally had political autonomy. Later on, these kahal was used by the state to collect taxes from them. And when it says linguistic autonomy, that's, Tom, you got to mute yourself. Linguistic autonomy, they spoke Yiddish. Hebrew is the scholarly language. They don't, Yiddish, it's another story. We're not going to deal with that much, but it doesn't emerge as a literary language until really the 19th century. There are some publications earlier, but in the 19th century, you begin to get a lot of publications. And its late emergence suggests why they say from the National Yiddish Book Center, some of you may be familiar with, they say there are about 40,000 books that were published in Yiddish. And that's the whole corpus. You got a few more now, but you can't think of a language that has such the ability to say, look, here's everything that was published. But anyway, going back again to this economic, not really autonomy, there was initially, but trade and crafts. And what's not mentioned here is tavern keeping. That was for a long time, a monopoly of Jews, and it really led to a lot of conflict. First, the peasants used the taverns, and it was a good place to be, but drunken brawls plus debts don't make for good relations in the long run. By 1885, we think there are about 4 million Jews in the Pale. And this was at a time of, well, there was in the Russian areas, you have this expulsion from rural areas. If you recall a scene from Fiddler on the Roof, the movie at the very end, everybody's leaving the village because they're being kicked out. They get deportations from Moscow and St. Petersburg, where they weren't supposed to be in the first place, but they moved in. And the towns, certain towns are barred, like Minsk. Jews are barred without a special permit. I'm going to read this here. In 1882, 500,000 Jews living in rural areas of the Pale were forced to leave their homes and live in towns or shtetls in the Pale. 250,000 Jews along the western frontier were also pushed into the Pale. And 700,000 Jews living east of the Pale were driven into the Pale by 1891. So it's really a population disaster for the Jews. And I should point out, when the First World War broke out, here's where a lot of the fighting was, right here. There was a decree, all the Jews were kicked out of an area, I think 50 kilometers from the border, because they were seen as potential German spies. So it was not a nice situation, and economically, it was very difficult. We know that this is the period of great emigration to America. Most of us here in this group, I assume, have family that came at that time. And it's, the population is just being pushed out of there. The great emigration. And a lot of it, I wanted to mention Brody. Here's this town right here. Brody's in Austria-Hungary. And it's the gateway to the West. So many of your ancestors came through Brody. Not a city where wisdom and wealth, Torah and understanding, commerce and faith are united. Well, you get a little carried away here, but it was in Austria-Hungary that had much more freedom for the Jews than Russia. And I just found this picture, this old postcard of the various buildings. Somebody says, Heinrich says, many greetings. That's what, viele Grüße, if you can read the old German Faktor, that's what it says, from 1898. So it happened because in 1789, Emperor Joseph II had decreed that legal documents be kept in German, and at the same time, they ended rabbinic courts. So all this in Austria-Hungary says there's increasing pressure to go to German schools, that the Jews are much freer in Western Galicia, which is Austria-Hungary, than in Eastern Galicia, which is Ukraine. Here's the town of Brody. It's a city of 20,000. City, 20,000, it doesn't sound so big now, but it was 2/3 Jewish, even in 1914. We're moving fast over this, but World War I in Ukraine, you got to remember, when you see all these movies about the trench war in France and Germany, the real sufferers in this war are in the East. And it's in Galicia in particular, where the armies go back and forth. There's a so-called Battle of Galicia in 1914, where you have 500,000 casualties in this series of battles. I mean, it's incredibly difficult in this area. It's not too mountainous, except Slovakia is mountainous, but lower, further south, it's not mountainous. And I wanted to do a little advertising for myself. There's a book by Ida Kowalska called The Rottenberg Family from Poland, Memories from a Village by the Buk River, translated by yours truly. And there's this quote, whoops, going too fast there. I'm going to read that quote. The young Rottenbergs, that's the name of the family, came to the conclusion that they were absolutely not ready for independent life in cities. the family set up a new set of buildings to supply the needs of the developing household. So they had this big farm, relatively prosperous family. They began to set up parcels for building homes for the families as the children had children. And then came August 1914, the army essentially requisitioned the entire inventory for work purposes. And there's a war front, preparing for a war front along the line of the Buk River. Evacuation of the village began quickly after receipt of the number order for immediate evacuation, and the Rottenbergs moved deep into Russia. And when they returned from evacuation, they were completely ruined. I think this is typical for Jews all in that area. So it's not just that they suffered the Nazis in World War II. The suffering started a lot earlier. You had this huge, as I mentioned, this huge population pressure, people leaving. Then the war came, and there's terrible suffering in this area. Then you have what's called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And the Germans imposed this treaty and a theoretically independent Ukraine. Didn't last long, but then you get a revolutionary independent Ukraine where for a short time the Jews did very well. 1918, they got taken into the government. We have pictures of currency in Ukrainian and Yiddish. And then within a year, tremendous series of pogroms. First, you have Ukraine, 1917, where they're proclaiming independence. And then the Jews, for a short time, are welcomed into the government. And then the pogroms started. These are some of the worst pogroms, well, certainly since the time of Khmelnytsky. And large numbers of Jews were killed everywhere. They're mainly the white armies, that is to say, anti-Bolshevik, because the Jews were seen as Bolshevik sympathizers, although they were not exactly exempt from attacks by Bolsheviks too. But in the main, Jews see themselves as better off under the Bolsheviks. And this, this is a tradition. Jews ally with the more powerful group. And in the long run, you're going to have a lot of problems because of that if that powerful group is overthrown. You get some anti-Semitic attacks in Polish Galicia, but nothing like what was going on in Ukraine. So on the map, here's this Polish Galicia, Lviv, Lvov, whatever you want to call it. Lemberg is this city that you may have heard of. May have some of you may have relatives that come from that area. This is the very eastern part of Austro-Hungarian Ukraine. Then here's a picture, unfortunately, of a pogrom in Kiev, Jews being attacked, 1919. And in 1919, a horrible picture, burial of the victims. Simon Petlura is a leader of these Ukrainian armies, and he's blamed. It isn't clear how much he approved the pogroms, but he did not do anything about them. And he is assassinated in 1926 in Paris. And there's this famous trial where the French jury finds the murderer innocent because he was said to be avenging his parents who were killed. So pogromщик, the assassination of Simon Petlura. It's not all bad news. Some of you may have heard this song. I thought I'd play a little bit of this song. Nostalgia for the past about bells, my Stefana. And I'm going to try to play this. Sometimes there's an issue with sound, so just wave to me if you don't get any sound. Are you hearing that?
There's no sound coming through.
No sound?
No.
No, that's true.
That's always an issue with YouTube. I apologize. I thought it would work.
But I found the Democrats picked up another seat.
Democrats picked up another seat from Bell's.
Exactly.
Anyway, this is just, if you look at this song, there's this nostalgia. At the bottom, the last verse in English, the little house is old, overgrown with moss. The little house is old, no glass in the windows. The little house is old, the walls are bent. I would surely not recognize it again. But there's this song that's so popular. You can look for it on the internet. Bells, Mein Städtler Bells.
Yeah.
Just if you go to YouTube and you put in BELZ, you'll find it. And
My cousin used to sing this all the time
yeah,
in the 40s and the 50s. I remember.
yeah, it was very popular. I regret that I wasn't able to play it, but back to the bad news. One of the things that the Russians did in Ukraine and in Russia in general, but was particularly tough in Ukraine, was collectivization of agriculture. It started in 1928, I think. Here is an image from Lenin where he says, the kulaks are the most brutal, the coarsest, the fattest explorers who have ever arisen in the history of other countries. The power of the landowners, the tsars, the priests, and the capitalists. Lots of the Russian agents to enforce collectivization are Jewish, because the Bolsheviks were the only group that welcomed them after the revolution. So you have this bad image of the Jews, and then there's this infamous famine in 1932 and 33 called the Holodomor, where some 4 to 6 million people died of starvation. The Ukrainians accused the Russians of genocide, of doing this intentionally against the Ukrainians. That may or may not be true, but there's no question that the Russians enforced this, like by force, taking away the seed grain from locals in order to feed people in other parts of Russia. So whether it's genocide or just brutality, large numbers of people in Ukraine died, and they haven't forgotten it. This is their Holocaust. It's still alive in the memory of Ukraine. This is what they say, the year of the artificial famine in Ukraine created by the Muscovite occupier. That's the Ukrainian image of what happened here. In the popular mind, the Jews are identified with the communists. And remember, we have it up here, the Muscovite occupier and the Jews. It's not a good situation for them. In 1939, you may remember there was a Nazi-Soviet pact that said the Nazis and the Soviets divided Poland. And I'm not sure, I don't know where this came from, communication of Ukraine. It should be communization of Ukraine. That is, the party came in any areas that were in Galicia, that they were taking over, were set up by the parties, and the Bolsheviks are identified in the popular mind as Jews in the Russian area. Well, then in 1941, the Soviet invasion of Ukraine, of the Soviet Union, and in the Ukraine, you have the emergent, one of the areas where these killing squads, mobile killing squads, is before their camps, what are called the Einsatztruppen. There were several divisions of them, some in the north that completely wiped out the Jews in the Lithuanian areas. But you get, here's this quotation, in this case, from Wikipedia. The Nazi occupation of Ukraine ended the lives of millions of civilians in the Holocaust and other mass killings. It is estimated 900,000 to 1.6 million Jews and 3 to 4 million non-Jewish Ukrainians were killed during the occupation. So you get this huge number of people being killed. These others are killed in the warfare. This all happens in the first 2 years of the war. And in opposition, you get Ukrainian nationalist activity, which includes volunteering for participation in massacres of Jews. Before I go on, I see a hand up. I'm sorry. Did you have a question? No. What happened is that these Ukrainian groups did attack the Jews. There's something called the SS Galician, which was formed as a division of the Waffen SS, and there were plenty of massacres. And Timothy Snyder points out by the 1943, the Galicians knew how to murder people, and they had finished off the Jews in most of the area, and then they turned on the Poles. So first you have the Jews, and then there are these huge numbers of Poles being attacked. And of course, in Poland, that's what's remembered, because they really did suffer. It's the equivalent of pogroms. So this is this Waffen SS division in Galicia, Ukrainian soldiers, what's called the Azov Regiment, and they still exist. So this is the core of Putin's claim that the Ukrainians are Nazis. I mean, there are pro-Nazi demonstrations in Ukraine, but they think there may be 2% of the army is from this Azov regiment. I'm not excusing it, but I'm saying that it's not a mass anti-Semitic movement in Ukraine. There are people, and there are people in the United States too. But anyway, that's the core of Putin's claim that, it's a denazification. That was one of the excuses he gave for invading Ukraine. After World War II, amazing that 40% of the Jewish population survived. And they survived mainly by going inland, So you'll meet Jews now born in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, or their parents. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Georgia. The Caucasian Jews were subject to murder. Somehow there weren't as many killed. But anyway, 60% of the population was killed. And after the war, Jews were met with a surge of anti-Semitic violence. People want to reclaim their homes, and you have people living there already. It was an unhappy situation, both in Ukraine and in Poland. And the Moscow and Kiev governments at that time denied there was anything unique about Jewish suffering. If you recall, this is a period of active anti-Semitism by the Soviet government. Here's an image. It says Zionism with a caricature of a Jewish capitalist. And here's another image at the time of the 1967 wars of Israel and the Arab states. It was not a good time for Jews in Russia. And remember, they were not able to emigrate. And that's when we get the Refusnik movement of the 1970s. In the 1960s, the Ukrainian and Jewish dissidents began to cooperate. The old charges began to decline, and especially then in the 1980s in particular, Ruch, this Ukrainian movement, was friendly to Jews in both Ukraine and Israel, and it actually campaigned against anti-Semitic attacks in the 1990s. And after 1991, the Jewish community still showed vitality. Here's a sign that says "Glory to Ukraine." I don't know what city that's taken in, but and here is in Jerusalem, Wailing Wall. Again, sympathy with Ukraine. Here's a chart of emigration from the 1970s to the present. In the 1970s and 80s, is mainly to the US, but also to Israel and Germany. After that, not so much the US. And after 1989, we think about 1 million people had Israeli visas. Not everyone who had an Israeli visa went to Israel. They think about, as you see on the bottom, 7.5% with Israeli visas went elsewhere. But still, look at these numbers. It's a huge numbers. And initially, it's Ukraine that's supplying the Jews. Look at this. 34,000 in these years, 12,000 opposed to 9 here. And if you go down, I mean, these are big, big numbers of people leaving, to the point of here in 2018, you're still getting a sizable immigration. It's quite a enormous movement of Jews. There's still a good relationship, by the way, between the Jews in Israel and the Jews in Ukraine. It's complicated. There are flights from until the war, there were flights from Tel Aviv to Kiev every day, people going back and forth, because there's still maybe 150,000 Jews in Ukraine. The Russians have charges of anti-Semitism, but the Ukrainians, at least so far, are not buying it. As you know, Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish. He was elected with 72% of the vote. And these are images. These are Ukrainian arriving in Israel. I'm not even sure whether it's in Israel or in Galicia. It says 120 years of the Brody Synagogue. So remember, we saw Brody. That was the city that was the center for immigrants. And that's what's embroidered on that Torah scroll. And Babin Yar, the memorial outside of Kiev, with that memorial to the Jews who were killed there. And remember, there are no ghettos under the Nazis in Ukraine. People were killed just by guns, horrible stuff. The ghettos and the camps are in Poland and in Austria, not in Ukraine. And if you're interested, here's some things that you can look at. Serhiy Ploche has a book on the history of Ukraine. On the web, you can get the YIVO Encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe, and there are many articles that you can read there. I mentioned two here, one on Hasidism and one on Yiddish. Anthony Polonsky has a 3-volume